All right, here's your bell work prompt for the day. Go ahead and pause it and spend about 5 minutes on it. Do prayer and then move on to the next slide. Y'all's got a reading quiz now, so Mr. Penny Legion is going to hand it out. Please fill it out, turn it over when you're done, and after approximately 5 minutes, move on to the next slide, and Mr. Penny Legion will collect the reading quizzes from you. So yesterday we talked about sin. Well, how do we get there? What moves us towards sin? We obviously have concupiscence, right? We have a tendency to sin. There's something that often tends to make sin a more prevalent issue, and that is this idea of a vice. A vice is a practice or a habit that leads us to continually sin, that makes it a more continual practice. So oftentimes, if we do a sin over and over again, it becomes pretty norm for us, and then we don't think twice about it. And that once we become kind of numb to that sin, we might elevate to a greater sin. So we might get used to lying about doing our homework, and then eventually that feels okay. So then we might start cheating on tests. That feels okay. We might plagiarize an important essay. That feels okay. A vice can kind of slowly start escalating. So once you have these notes written down, go ahead and move to the next slide. So, vices. What are some vices? What are some things that cause us to sin? Go ahead and brainstorm for about a minute with your partner. Pause me, and after a minute, come back to the slide. So, some vices that you may have come up with. Jealousy. Jealousy is definitely a vice, right? Jealous behavior tends to lead us to do sinful acts. Anger. Anger can be really healthy, but if we continually dwell in our anger or let our anger get out of control, it can lead us in a bad path as well. Slander. That means false gossip, like things that we're purposely trying to ruin someone's reputation. That is a form of a vice. Cowardice. Being a coward, not standing up for things, can also be a vice. And impatience. Impatience is definitely a vice. So I want you to turn to your partner and spend 2 minutes coming up with how do these attitudes or behaviors move us closer to sin. After those 2 minutes are up, 3 of you should share out to the greater class. So spend 2 minutes brainstorming, and then 3 of you are going to raise your hand and share out to the rest of the class what you and your partner came up with. Then you can move to the next slide. All right, if vices lead us towards sin, they make it easier for us to sin, then what will help us move away from sin? Well, the opposite of a vice is a virtue. A virtue is basically habitually forming ourselves to do good actions. The more I do good things, the more I open the door for a stranger if I do it on a regular basis, right? I can create a habit of that. And that is a virtue. It is training myself to do the good acts so that it becomes second nature. Once you have this information down about virtue, go ahead and move on to the next slide. So, what are some virtues? Go ahead and brainstorm for a minute with your neighbor and then come back to this slide. Some virtues you may have come up with are assertiveness, cheerfulness, integrity, reliability, patience, and understanding. I want you to turn to your partner and spend about 2 minutes thinking, how would these be virtues? How do these lead us to positive, good actions? Then you can move on to the next slide after 2 minutes and 3 people sharing out to the greater class. These should be a different 3 people from the last share out. Mr. Penny Legion, hold them accountable to that. So when we talk about virtues, there's 4 big ones. They're called cardinal virtues. And basically, they get the word cardinal virtue because cardinal means to pivot or to hinge. And so they're basically the essential virtues for living a Christian life. So we're going to go over what are those 4 essential virtues that we should be forming in our lives as Christians. So they are prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. If you've heard of them, that's awesome. If you haven't, we're going to go over it. Do not stress. When you're ready to move to the next slide, go ahead and progress forward in the video. Prudence is the inclination toward choosing the moral good. It's basically the opposite of being impulsive. Instead of just going quickly with your gut, it helps you be more thoughtful and reflective, gives you judgment and discernment. So you are very thoughtfully reflecting. You're not just jumping in and hoping for the best. Prudence is really more of a thoughtful, reflective approach to a moral problem. So when you have this written down, you may move on to the next slide. Justice, something we all love. Justice basically means that not only are you doing right by your neighbor, but you're also doing right by God. So you're making sure that everyone is receiving their rights and everything is just. So you're paying attention to the needs of others in the community, not just yourself. It's not about being equal per se, because life shouldn't always be equal, and it can't be equal, but it should be equitable. It should be so that everyone receives what they need to be on an even playing field ultimately in the end. It's about loving and serving people. And that is very, very important because God calls us to work for justice. When you have this slide information down, you can move on to the next slide. Fortitude, strength, courage. This is very important because we will have moments in our lives where we're faced with really tough decisions. And we have to have the courage or the strength to endure through those tough times and to choose the good. This is what we see often in the lives of saints, in the lives of leaders of civil rights movements, where you have to have strength to keep doing what's right and good, even in the face of challenge or persecution. So even though sometimes it would be easier to go along with the system or to go along with the morally wrong, it's having the strength and the courage to keep doing what is right, especially when the world wants a yes from you, as the quote says to the right of the notes. When you have these notes, you can move on. And temperance. Temperance is all about balance. Basically, it means you have self-control. So as much as I love cookies, temperance means that I balance that and I don't eat cookies for every meal, right? It's about knowing how to balance your life between your work life and your play life. It's about knowing how to be healthy, but not obsessively healthy. It's about knowing how to have fun, but knowing how to moderate that so you're not having too much fun. You're not making poor decisions around that. So temperance is really about finding that balance, or if we want to use some Buddhist terminology, finding that middle way. When you have this, move on to the next slide. So we're going to have this discussion as a class. Obviously, I'm not there to lead it, so it's going to rely on you guys to do a great job of setting this example for Mr. Penny Legion. Here are some questions I would love for you to discuss as a class. So what are some steps you could use to live out the cardinal virtues more fully? What way is holy names helping or hindering you living those out? What ways do the cardinal virtues lead to living out other virtues? So spend about 10 minutes having this discussion. People, please chime in, help each other out, and have a fruitful discussion. After 10 minutes, then you can move on to the last piece of the activity for the day. If there's time, you and your partner are going to get a little quiz, and I want you to figure out which cardinal virtue is being displayed or would be best utilized in each of the scenarios. It is okay if you get it wrong. I just want to see if you can kind of figure out how they're at play in realistic aspects of your life. So go ahead and take this quiz. If the class doesn't get to this, that is okay as well. But please, if there's time, take the quiz with your partner